G'day everyone and welcome back to the Wixie 500 YouTube channel. In this video I want to show you how I built this, the Tyrrell 023 Yamaha from the 1995 Formula 1 season. So here's a photograph of the real car being driven by Mika Salo. There was nothing special from a performance perspective. The thing didn't score any wins or podiums, and it didn't finish half of its races. And so, people sometimes wonder why Tamiya produced the model, but it was driven by a Japanese driver with Japanese money and a Japanese engine, so you can sort of understand Tamiya's perspective from there. I decided to run with the Mika Salo version because he was clearly the better of the two drivers that ran this for most of the season, and I also decided to just build this as it come from the kit without the tobacco markings. It was sponsored by Mold 7, but the kit does not include the tobacco markings and just has the Tyrrell markings here instead, so I just went with that. I didn't use any aftermarket specific decals or detail upsets specific to this kit, but I did put some scratch built items in it and use some carbon decals in a few places as well, which you'll see as we progress through the video. Now this is what you get in the kit. This is a Tamiya 120 scale plastic kit, and it's kit number 42 in the Grand Prix collection that company does. And there's not a lot of parts in this compared to some of their other Formula 1 offerings. So there's the main sprue with the floor and the engine part, engine halves and a few other bits and pieces in there. And most of the bodywork is on this white plastic sprue, although the monocoque is a separate piece in its own bag, as is the rear wing, molded in black. And then the other sprue here is of the wheels and suspension arms and hubs and brakes and a few other bits and pieces. Or two different decal sheets, so a number of the white pieces are provided as panels to put on, but I ended up spraying that. And the blue, I elected to go with the decals rather than masking, and I'll show you that a little bit later on. Now with the kits these days, I sort of use the instructions as a bit of an idea, as a guide to what I'm doing, but I typically clip the parts off, prepare them all bit by bit, glue pieces together that can be glued, and don't necessarily build in the strict order of the instructions. So here I'm just sort of getting some main parts together, and on the engine cover, for example, and when fitting that onto the floor tray, notice I was always getting this gap for some reason. And then I put the floor tray on a piece of glass and noticed that the thing has got this really quite angled arch when it should be flat. So I couldn't get things to fit. So I boiled the kettle, put hot water in a tray, dropped the floor tray in the tray, and tried to manipulate it to bend it back flat. Now, as a consequence of doing that, I got the main part of the floor flat, but then this tray at the front started to curl up, so I had to then heat the middle part here to get that back down again. But that was required to get it all nice and flat, because it's the datum, if you like, for the rest of the build. So if that's not going to be flat, and I've seen photographs of where people have built this, and the car's got an arch in it, so it must be a fairly common thing, having an arched floor tray in this model. But anyway, once that was all sorted, that bodywork is now sitting down flat on here. Now, with the engine cover, these little tabs are included to help it clip into the monocoque. But the thing is, all I can see these doing is chipping paint and damaging decals. So I ended up chopping them off. They serve to, as far as I'm concerned, they serve no purpose, because the bodywork, the engine cover, sits on the model fine as it is. It doesn't need the clips. And then, as you can see here, it sits in there fine. So this is just test fitting the monocoque onto the floor, and the side pods are attached to the main chassis part and the engine cover, just making sure it all fits before we get into doing any painting and substantial gluing and that sort of thing, particularly since the floor was not very good to begin with. This is the diffuser that comes up from the plank at the rear of the car, and like a lot of kits, you get these injection pin marks as part of the manufacturing process. and they don't look any good when they're visible. So a lot of my builds now, I try and fill the visible ones, and it's just a case of putting in some filler. I'm just using Tamiya's surface primer that you brush into the holes. Now you need to be aware that this stuff does shrink, so you need to overfill, and then it settles down and you sand it back, and sometimes you need to put further applications in. So that's still wet there by the look of it, and then sanded down. Now I didn't worry about doing the ones at this end because those aren't visible when this part gets glued into the car. A lot of filler was required on the left-hand side pod here. All right, so filling that in, letting it dry, sanding it down, putting more in. There's not as much required on the right-hand side, but still some of these gaps, just where the parts go in, trying to get this all to look as one piece, because in real life the whole engine cover went on as a one-piece unit, but as far as the kit manufacturing, there's several parts that have to be put together to make up the engine cover. And then just progressively sanding things down and putting some primer over the side of the side pod just to get a closer eye of what's going on. Again, there's a fair bit of filler here on the left-hand side, but the right-hand side didn't require anywhere near as much. But the advantage of putting just a thin coat of primer in, you can see these sort of little sink marks that are not clearly visible when you're just looking at the plastic, at least for me anyway. The primer makes it much easier to see what's going on. This is the floor. Again, pin marks, filling in the ones that are going to be visible, not worrying about the ones that are not going to be visible. And then when they've been filled and smoothed off, ready for paint. Now, also did a little bit underneath, just to see how it goes really. There were some sink marks in the plank that I fixed up, but looking at this in the photograph, you can see there's a sink mark here and also over the side here from the some shrinkage, I guess, from the plastic when it was all put together. I didn't bother about that. Now with my builds, I normally clip everything off the sprue to prepare the parts individually, but there are some parts that I think are worthwhile leaving on. And these end plates from the front wing are an example. They have to be painted black on one side and they have to be white on the other side, and it's difficult to mount that, so I just leave it on the sprue. Where the mounting tabs are, that's going to be at the bottom of the model and not visible anyway, so I'm happy to do the painting on the sprue and then clip these particular pieces off. And this is just filling them in again with that primer, the filler primer, putting it in the dots and sanding it down smooth, ready for paint. And then when the parts are, the seam lines are removed, the fit has been checked, it's time to wash it all up, a bit of hot soapy water just to get rid of any plastic dust and fingerprints and that sort of stuff. And then it's moving on to the next step of putting some primer on. Now, this has got a light coat of grey primer on all of the body parts, simply because the filling primer is grey on the bodywork, and I just wanted to have a uniform base colour underneath. So everything got a very light spray of grey, and then went on to the white primer a little bit later on. As far as the engine is concerned, just masked off with some tape and using flat aluminium, depending on which country you're from, on the engine block. So I just use the acrylic and just put it through the air gun to do the engine block. This is after running through with a batch of semi-gloss black. So we've got the wing end plates here, the black on the side that the holes were filled on, but also doing the floor tray, the rims, there's the diffuser, some suspension parts and so on. So this is just drying after it had been sprayed in the booth. Then doing some more painting and assembly. So we've got the bulkhead with the steering wheel and some controls, decal for the dash, and just hand painting some of the switches and knobs. And up here is the gearbox. That was a mix of, I think it was flat brown and gunmetal. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but whatever the paint call out was in the Tamiya instructions is what was used on this, and that was just brush painted on for the gearbox casing. Now this is the rear suspension, the push rods and valve crank and shock absorbers, but they've been moulded as one part, and that's not how it is on the real race car. So where these tweezers are holding this little plastic bridge in between, that's not on the real car. So I got rid of it and made these two separate pieces, which is what they should be. Now these are just the main body parts after they've been hit with some white primer before the gloss coats go down. And down the bottom here, these are those front wing end plates. So they're black on the reverse side, and then I've just put some masking tape over the black so that when these are being sprayed with the white primer and also when the white body colour goes on, it's not going to get on the black. Engine block after a bit more work, so the covers are on the top of the heads with some decals and a bit of carbon there as well. Rear axles go in. All right, and then there's a bit of a wash put on this. In retrospect, maybe I could have gone a bit heavier on the wash on the gearbox, but I'm happy with that. Now these are the two rear suspension push rods and springs. Just as they're being painted, I just hand painted those, and that's just a progress shot. They're not finished in this particular photo. Just some of the parts. The branding decals on the rims, and just hand painting some silver on some of the fittings, or where there would be fittings on the suspension. Gloss coat onto the main body is what this one's about, and again just drying in the booth. Masked off the floor and just use, I think it was Dectan through the air gun. So mask it off, spray it, and then masking tape comes off and nice crisp lines. This photo's really made this look quite lighter than what it is, and then I've gone back afterwards and filled in these mounting holes with some black and some wash to sort of dull it down a bit and pull out that detail. Now this is just dry fitting. There's some body work on the left. This is the left side. There's also another piece on the right hand side that have to be glued to the sides of the gearbox. But when it glues in, it has to also line up with the floor, and it has to line up with the bodywork when the engine cover goes on. So when I glued these onto the engine, I've then put the engine and gearbox into the floor, and that's not glued in, but needs to be mounted to the floor so that these parts can set at the right angle. It's just a technique I use to make sure that these little pieces of bodywork are lining up when they dry. Otherwise it's a little bit hit and miss. So a lot of masking tape on bodywork here because there's going to be another batch of semi-gloss black. I like to try and do things in batches rather than part by part. Now what's going on here in the middle is this is one of the barge boards that goes between the monocoque and the front suspension. It's already been painted bodywork white on the reverse side, which is what the masking tape is stuck to. And this side has to be black, but there's 4 little mounting holes that the braces that mount this to the car need to be fitted in, and I didn't want paint getting in those, so I've just put some really tiny little balls of blue tack on each of these mounting points, so I can then hit this with the black and then just pull the blue tack off afterwards, and that will reveal the original plastic for the plastic cement to pick up, because when you've got paint in the way, the plastic cement doesn't work as well. So then after they've been painted, just pull the blue tack off and clean mounting points ready for the mounting braces to go on. Front wing body colour is already done on the top flaps, and the kit calls for the main plane to be done in semi-gloss black, but I used some carbon decal on this and also on a few other parts. But because it was just a sheet of decal, this is not an aftermarket pre-cut sheet. I've had to use a bit of masking tape to do a bit of a template, and these little notches in the corners, for example, are just to clear the top flap mounts. And also this is long enough, this front piece here will fold over and underneath the front leading edge of the wing. Some more masking and spraying. There's been some semi-gloss black done, and what's happened here is this is the rear bulkhead has been masked off after it had been painted, and some flat aluminium put onto the radiators. And this is now getting ready to start the decaling process. So the engine is just sitting in there, and the monocoque and side pod pieces are all being taped down so that they're going to be secure. Engine cover goes on, gets taped down to hold all of this in place. I can't go gluing it in yet because there's other work to be done, but we need to be able to hold it down and keep it solid to do the decaling, because those decals, we need to get them lined up over multiple pieces of bodywork. Now with the original decal sheet, I was a little bit concerned, and I'm not sure if this is going to show up on the video, but it looks like there's hairline cracks through the decals. And this is quite an old kit now, and I was worried that they had deteriorated and that they were going to fall apart when I went to use them. So before doing anything, I took a couple of photocopies of this so that if something went wrong, I'd still had some dimensions to create some templates to go and paint the blue if the decal side of it didn't work. But thankfully the decals, whatever you want to call them, did work out okay. So just cut them up and start placing and applying them. But very time consuming because there's some complex curves to get around. These bumps for the front suspension, for example, were very difficult and couldn't quite get it spot on. But I think overall for putting decals on this sort of a curve, it's come up pretty good. And this is just more with the engine cover as well. Multiple pieces make this up. The air intakes at the back here, I just went in afterwards and just used just hand painted some Tamiya blue into those to match. And then putting the signage on. So all of the blue goes down first, and then all of the signage goes on top. So there's some more here cut out, but I cut closer to the edges before I put these on. Tire decals on the side for later on. These are scrap bits of paper, but you can see up the top here the front wing is in the process of being done, and the rear wing's waiting there as well. Now these are the solutions that I use, the micro set ones, and also these Mr. Mark Setter and Mark Softer, which are stronger than these other ones. So I had to use some of the strong stuff to get around some of these curves. But if you're using these stronger ones, be careful because you can melt the decal film and then you're in big trouble. Now this was mostly an out-of-box build, but there's a few areas where I added some extra detail, and one of them is in the rear suspension. The car ran like a double shock absorber setup, and Tamiya didn't include the second lot, so I've just used some little pieces of solder here, flattened the ends and just put some little grooves in to help the mounting, and then painted them up, just hand painting these, and also a bit of bare metal foil with some red on it to produce these things at the back, and then just use a bit of super glue to mount them in. Okay, so they attach to the bell crank, and it's part of the rear suspension of this car, in addition to the main damper and spring. Now, this is still not perfect. In fact, it's far from it, because the shock absorbers at this end should be mounted to some bracketry on the top of the gearbox that Tamiya just didn't include in the kit. So I didn't get to that extent, but yeah, it's not correct as it is here. I've also added some hoses to the oil tank here, down into the gearbox, and also what I assume is an electrical box here, and just put some wires leading into the engine area, which is how it looks on some photos. I don't know where these actually go, so they've just been put into the engine, and when the intake tray and the injector rail and everything goes on, you can't see where they go anyway. Right, so in this particular photo, the engine and gearbox is basically done and ready to fit. I also put on some gold foil on the lower rear suspension, because that's where the exhausts blow onto it, and on the real car they did use some heat shielding, so that's just a gold bare metal foil piece cut up and wrapped over on there. Just a progress pic of various parts after they've been decorated with the decals. No clear on it at this point. So this is the first lot of clear going on, just using Tamiya's TS13 clear run through the airbrush. The rear wing used some carbon across the main plane and also on the sides, and I did also make up another piece on here, just hadn't applied it when this photograph was taken. There's an aftermarket decal kit for this, for carbon decals, to basically kit out the entire model with carbon rather than using the semi-gloss black, but I just used it on a few main areas from a stock sheet that I had to cut the pieces up to fit. The brakes were just hand painted, a mixture of titanium gold and some flat earth around the edges of the discs, and gunmetal for the friction surfaces, and then just put some wash through it and picked out the bolt heads with some aluminium. So a lot of this is really quite hidden. Once the wheels go on, you can't really see it, so I didn't get too fussed with it, but they look okay for hand painted pieces, I think. Now this is after the first lot of clear, and this is a really risky part of getting a good finish on a model, is carefully polishing down the clear to get rid of the ridges that are produced from the decal. So this F1 decal, for example, and this Nokia are separate pieces that go over the blue, and you can see the edging here where there's evidence that it's not all flat. So very carefully rub this down. Now ideally I'd like to have gone further to take more of that ridge out, but you always run the risk of hitting the decal, and I didn't want to do that. So take it down to this level, put more clear on, and repeat the process basically to try and remove evidence of these being individual markings. And same sort of thing on the side here. These sponsor logos are actually one decal, and you can see the outer edge of the film on this. Okay, so sanding it down, or polishing it down was probably a better term to use, and then ready for more clear to go over. I hope you're enjoying the build. Tune in for part 2, which starts off with a big disaster.